We'll keep your Bibles open there to Matthew for just a moment. We're going to look at just a couple of the verses that Jackson just read for us, and then we're going to make our way to Ephesians chapter 6. So if you want to maybe kind of put a ribbon in that passage, we'll be getting there in just a moment. I'm going to begin our sermon off doing something that I have been advised and have advised others never to do from the pulpit, and that is alienate your audience. But for the purpose of making an illustration, I'm going to risk alienating a large percentage of our audience today, because we're going to talk about Blockbuster for a moment. Think about Blockbuster. For those of you who don't know, Blockbuster was something that I'm afraid you just probably will never get the opportunity to experience as this sort of model for entertainment has kind of went by the wayside. I can fondly remember the days of walking up and down the aisles of Blockbuster, or in my city, it was Hollywood Video. I don't know how many of you guys might have been familiar with that. We'd walk up and down the aisles looking for that movie that was out that everybody was talking about that we wanted to see, or in my case, oftentimes it was a video game. Yeah, you could rent a video game and go home and play it and then had to bring it back at a future point. So at the turn of the century, Blockbuster reigned supreme. They were kind of the king, and there's still evidence of this. If you drive down 27, there's, for some unknown reason, a Blockbuster sign on the side of the road, which still baffles me every time I see it. But family movie night, that craved moment when you would come together as a family, scroll through Blockbuster's, and I say scroll, I'm even talking about how we think of it today. We'd stroll through Blockbuster's selection of movies, and we would go and find that movie that we've been looking. We'd take it to the front. You'd hand your membership card to somebody dressed in all blue, and you would check that out. And they would say, okay, you got to bring it back on this date. And sometimes you'd go to give that to them, and they say, you can't have this movie because you didn't give the last one back, and we're still waiting for it. You're going to have to go find that movie and bring it back before you can take another one out. This was what life was like at the turn of the century for family entertainment. A man by the name of Reed Hastings approached the CEO of Blockbuster, John Antioco, in 2000 and said, I would like to propose a merger, a partnership. I have this company, I think it might be going somewhere. It's called Netflix. And he went on to describe this idea of, we'll have the movies, we'll mail them. They don't have to leave their houses. And you know what? No late fees. They keep them as long as they want. They can't get another one until it comes back, but when they mail it back, we'll automatically put a new one in the mailbox. And the CEO of Blockbuster laughed him out of the boardroom. That's just completely ridiculous idea. 10 years later, Netflix is the number one source of online streaming entertainment with 20 million subscribers, and Blockbuster filed for bankruptcy. That illustrates something that I think the Ephesian author, that Paul in the Ephesian letter is illustrating. It illustrates change. When we think back to the early 2000s and you think about home entertainment, you recognize huge change in the way that things were done then, by the way things are done now. And that's just one of many examples. Think about the introduction of the automobile and how that drastically changed life. It changed not just how we get to places, it changed our thinking. We were rewriting the way that we think about concepts such as distances. Take everybody's car away today. At best, making it here to worship is kind of an inconvenience. For some of you, it's completely inconceivable. It completely changed the way we think about distances. Long distance shifted from the next town over to the next state over, the next coast. Completely changed the way we think about things. The introduction of things like AC, air conditioning, completely modernized the way we think of home comfort. But I think one of the greatest changes that we saw was the introduction of the telephone. And I'm sure there's some of you that still remember as that was kind of crafted and rolled out, the idea of the party line, where there would be a bunch of houses on one line, and depending on how many times it rang, that was whether or not it was your house or the next door neighbor's house. And guess what? You could listen in on their phone calls just by picking that receiver up. And then we kind of shifted to having a more secure way to communicate. And we all had our phones. They were connected to cords, and they were mounted on the wall, and you couldn't walk away from it. You sat there maybe in the kitchen in your family, or maybe it was in the living room, but you sat there and had your conversations. Then we got a little bit more freedom, and then we got them in our bedrooms, and we could have a little bit more privacy. But the connection, if automobiles kind of brought us closer together by shortening the distance, phones made it to where we didn't have to leave our house to have our friends, our loved ones, our families right there with us having these conversations. And today, I would say there's very few of us get out of our bed without our phone in our, it's the first thing we do. Maybe you get up and you grab your phone as you just go to get ready for the day. And whether or not you think that's a good thing or a bad thing is a whole nother lesson. But we have seen such drastic change. But has it fundamentally, it may change the way we think about things, it may change the way we act, but has it fundamentally changed our lives? In the sense of, if you give up your car, and you give up your phone, and you even give up your Netflix account, if you give these things up, you still have a life to live. I don't think for many of us, we really recognize what grand scale change looks like, not the way that others in other countries maybe do. Countries where someone else has come in and conquered and taken over the control of, and life drastically changes in such a way that what I used to know as my normal can never again be my normal. I will never again be a citizen of this country. I'm now a citizen of something else. We may not see it on those scales. We do see it on maybe very small scales. In 1999, a football team in Tennessee known as the Oilers, maybe some of you all remember them, changed their name to the Tennessee Titans. Now, they did this for obvious reasons. Where they came from, oil was more significant than it was in Tennessee, but they changed their name to the Titans. Players couldn't just go, I'm going to put on the Oiler outfit. I like being the Oilers. I'm putting on that team uniform, and I'm coming out to play. No. You had a drastic change. You can no longer be an Oiler. You are now a Titan. And this is the drastic change that the Ephesian letter is describing to us. There is a change that demands an alteration of your life on an infinitely greater scale than a football team change, on an infinitely greater scale than a citizenship change. There is something that has happened. Chapter 1 of Ephesians, you were adopted by the God of creation. You are my child now. There is a change because you're a part of a new family. Chapter 2, you were dead and I made you alive. Drastic change, demanding an alteration of our life. Verse 14, 16 puts those thoughts together. This new family is made up of formerly dead people who now live, and they come from all different walks of life and all different nationalities, but they are new and they are singular and they are united into one man. I might say it is the recreation of humanity. That is a drastic change. And the author of the Ephesian letter, why do I keep saying that? Paul, who wrote the Ephesian letter, is saying this change demands a transformation in our lives. What he's telling us, we need to live lives that show the worthiness of the change that God has produced in us. There's a quote from a popular TV show, not one that I'm certainly not endorsing, but a quote that as I prepared for this, and I thought about this idea of change and living lives worthy of the change that's been produced in us, this quote came up. And as I kind of looked into the context of it, it was a very interesting idea. So it's from the TV show Yellowstone, and that follows the life of a ranch owner and his ranch hands and the corruption in Montana that surrounded all that. So the quote is this: "The brand isn't something you earn, it's something you live up to." And the concept of that quote coming about is a rather frightening one. A ranch hand, a cowboy, someone who's come to work on this farm, is literally being branded with a hot red iron. They're branding the Yellowstone ranch brand onto his chest. And they tell him, he's saying, I'm not worthy of this. I'm just a mess up. Why do you have any interest in me? I've ruined everything. He tells him, you don't get this brand because you've earned it. We're not giving you this because you've proven yourself to be a great cowboy. We're giving this because we're giving you a chance and we're demanding that you live up to it. Now, in that setting, there were some great consequences. In our setting, I think the consequences are even higher. But we see that we have been branded, changed, transformed, not because of who we were, because of who God is. He has transformed us, and He calls us to live up to that. And a great example is our Bible reading that we just had, when Jesus goes to Simon Bar-Jonah and says, you will now be known as Peter, Petros, the rock. What had Peter done to prove himself up to this point? Well, nothing to prove that he was this solid foundation, short of making this claim, this confession that you are the Son of God, you are the Christ. His life has shown that he is bossy and that he has a desire to prove himself and to show what he can do. And it really seems a lot like it's about Peter and what he thinks. And you know what? Jesus gives him this new name. He brands him. He transforms him and changes him from Simon into Peter. And what does he do? Immediately shows how squishy he is. Not the firm foundation of a rock. He immediately stands in between Jesus and God and says, God's will not be accomplished. When Jesus says, I must die, and he says, I will not allow it. And on the day of Jesus' arrest, Peter doesn't display himself as that solid ground that everyone can cling to, and he will hold this group together. He joins in with all the rest of them as they run away. In fact, it's really not until we see Peter by the sea that we see the extent of which Jesus has given him this name, when he calls him to live up to this brand. Live up to your calling as the rock. Take care of this flock. Tend them. Love them. Provide for them. Care for my sheep. Friends, we have not earned the branding, the name of Christian. We were without a family. We were lost in sin. We were dead to God. We had done nothing to prove ourselves. In fact, when Paul writes to the Romans, he says we were enemies. We'd done everything to show that we had no friendship with God. And at a time like that, God sent His Son, and He adopted us. And He gave us life. And He forgave and justified us. And He united us. And Paul says that is your brand, and that is what you walk according to and you live up to. And what we're reading here in the close of this letter, as we start to draw towards the end of it, is God has given us fantastic opportunities to live up to the change that He has produced in us, in our marriage, in our families, in our homes. And what we'll see today is also in our work. And that's a lot of introduction to a lesson that I hope for many of you aren't hoping lives up to the legend that whenever there's a handout for my lesson, if it's short, we're going to be here forever. I hope that that's not the case, because I hope to be very quick with what we're going to look at. If you're in Ephesians chapter 6, we're going to look at verses 5 through 9. We're going to read these. And really, I hope to be quick with it because it's a repeat. It's a repeat of what Paul has already said multiple times. He's given us these exact same things. And what we're going to see here is not any great difference. And so that's why I wanted to spend so much time stressing to us that while we might be reading this and say, okay, he's saying the same thing that he said before, why is he saying it? Because God has changed you. God has fundamentally changed you in ways that are so big that they demand an alteration of our lives. We simply cannot stay dead when we've been made alive. We cannot stay orphans when we've been adopted into the family. We cannot stay divided when we've been united as one with God. And so He calls for us to see that, and I call for us to see that as well. You have been changed. Live in changed ways. So let's read these verses together. Ephesians chapter 6, verses 5 through 9. Slaves, be obedient to those who are your masters, according to the flesh, with fear and trembling in the sincerity of your heart as to Christ, not by way of eye service as men pleasers, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. With good will render service as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatever good thing each one does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether slave or free. And masters, do the same things to them, and give up threatening, knowing that both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no partiality with him. Have you ever walked into the middle of a conversation and been completely shocked by what you heard out of context? I want you to imagine that after services are over and all of our young guys are kind of gathered and they're talking and they're discussing with one another and talking about how Jackson Ray stole, and they're all just giving him high fives and just saying, it looked amazing while you were doing it, and you just walk in the midst of that, and your mind immediately goes to petty theft and shoplifting and maybe vandalism, and it could have possibly be breaking and entering as well, only to find out they're talking about the baseball game from the day before and stealing a base. There is much of that in the situation that we just read. So many who come to this language and they hear out of context phrases like slave and master and immediately are uneasy and are shocked and try to justify, or maybe not justify, try to wrap their mind around how does it condone such terrible things? There's a few points I want to make before we really jump into these verses. Number one, this is not talking about things that happened in more modern history, such as American slavery. Things which the Bible would never describe. People being treated in ways in which the Bible would never justify. The Bible would never condone. And when you hear people talk about that in ways that are callous and seem to have no concern for the things that have been done, the wrongs that have been committed in history, and prop the Bible up and say the Bible doesn't condemn that, they're foolish and they're wrong. That is not what is being discussed here. We must understand that the Greek word that's being used here more accurately details someone who is literally or even sometimes just metaphorically bonded to someone else because of a financial status. It is because of, sometimes it was people who became slaves or went into servitude because they could not provide for their family. They needed a way to take care of their family, and so they willingly joined themselves into this relationship where they would have a master who was over them so that they could take care of their loved ones, provide for those that they had a requirement to provide for. There were also others who got themselves in this situation through poor choices, who would become indebted to such a way that they had to work that debt off, or would break laws and commit crimes in such a way that they would be forced into this idea of servitude or slavery. When we read in the Ephesian letter and in other places where Paul uses this language, we're not talking about the racially motivated discrimination and persecution of others that were weaker and did not have the ability to get themselves out of the situation they were in. This is not what is described at all when he talks about this. And thus, the word slave is accurate, but some translations will use the word bond servant, because that's truly what is being described, someone who has been bonded as a servant to another. Paul does not endorse what is going on. Another point to consider. In these passages, he doesn't endorse what's going on, but he also doesn't petition to abolish what's going on either. Instead, he calls for people to see the situation as it was in that day in context, and to see that no matter what your circumstance is, God has changed you. God has fundamentally transformed everything about your reality, no matter what it looks like, and to live in such a way that others could say they see Christ living in you. So the first thing I want to make is that point right there. We must understand the phrase, the terminology that he used, and we must understand it in its context. We must not use these passages to prop up sin, but we must understand the validity of the point that Paul is making. The second thing is this. Sometimes we'll read this and we'll say, well, this is just simply talking about employment then. This is not talking about employment then. If we understand what I've just said, it is exactly what we've described. But having said that, if this is true of people who have been put into this situation by necessity, who have been put into this situation by poor choices, people who don't have a power to say, you know what? I'm just going to quit. I'll go find a new job. I'll go find a new master. They've put themselves in the situation. They're contractually in it. They are sometimes outside of their will in it. When they're in there, and Paul says this applies to you, while that is vastly different than employment, that tells us then how much more it implies to us that have some more freedoms and more powers than were described in these relationships. These principles that we learn are very much applicable to us. And so because of that, when we don't see this situation in our lives, we do see the idea of an employer-employment situation, and I want to see how these principles can be applicable and can change the way that we think about the way we work. And so, 3 things that we're going to consider. This new character of life for a Christian worker. Number 1, very obvious. It's hard not to read this and not see it right off the bat. Be obedient. Workers are to show obedience as to Christ. There are many things that are evident, but chiefly of them seems to be this. You do what you're told. You're a servant of the Lord Most High, and so your employer gives you a task, you're going to carry that out. As someone who has been changed by Christ, has been changed by His sacrifice, has been adopted into the family of God, we are going to carry out the things that have been required of us. But as we read through this, I hope that we will note that this is not just an instruction, workers going to work. It says you're going to do it with the right attitude. It's not that we are going to, when the boss is looking, he says, hey, I expect you to do this, perform this task. And we say, yeah, I'm going to do it. When he turns around, I'm going to mock him. I'm going to roll my eyes. I'm going to get it done, but I'm going to kick rocks the whole way and have a bad attitude about it every step of the way. That's not the way he describes it at all. It says that we are to serve, we are to work for our masters, we are working for an employer in the context that we're looking at the same way that we would work for Christ. Calls for us to remember as we serve in this way, we are serving the Son of God. Verse 3 goes on to say, do that with good will. The Greek term that is used there means it comes from kindness, and do that with kindness. When you serve, you're asked to do something. Maybe it's a job you don't like. Maybe it's a job that you do like. Whatever, you put out kindness as you do that. But that word has a root word. And the root of the Greek word that is translated goodwill comes from peace, specifically having a spirit of peace, a peaceable spirit. This attitude towards your boss or manager is to be one of peace. I am not warring against you. I'm not defiant. I'm not fighting. And even when I'm obedient and I'm doing the task that you have called me to do, we have peace. You have peace with me. I have peace with you. And know that that's not dependent upon them. It's not dependent upon them asking you the right way. It's not dependent upon them considering your situation. Don't you know I have a family? Don't you know I have children that are doing these extracurricular activities? Don't you know that I want to go home just like everybody else, and you've asked me to stay late and to do this? And don't you know what that's going to cost me? despite not caring at all about who you are. Paul says, obey with goodwill, with a peaceable spirit, with kindness, show obedience to masters. And so to our employers, we would think to a very high level, we would seek to perform these actions with the same form of attitude. And I think a great example of that, a great example of this service, this obedience with goodwill, is seen in John chapter 13. When we go to John chapter 13, you read about Jesus, and he is washing the feet of the disciples. That is a task that is well below him, well below a teacher, a rabbi, indescribably below the Son of God, the creator of all things, the creator of the feet that he is about to wash, should never have to humble himself and humiliate himself, to wrap a towel around himself and bend down and begin washing the feet of his disciples. And yet think about the attitude in which Jesus does this. He won't be persuaded against it. He does it for people that don't deserve it, even people that he knows have ill will towards him. He doesn't go down the line and here's James and I got your feet shined up and here's John and Sons of Thunder are done and then here comes Judas and he says, you know what, next. Judas, no, you're not getting the feet treatment. He doesn't take Judas and kind of go, all right, you're done. I imagine that he put the same heart and the same time and the same effort. I imagine he put even more into Judas Iscariot. He was peaceable. A spirit of peace, because he knew this isn't about me. This isn't about them. This is about the will of him who sent me. This is about the will of the Father, that I pray, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. He calls us to mimic. He calls us to put that same attitude in our lives. That we are changed by the Father. We have been transformed into people of his family, and so we call for our Father's will to be done on earth as it is in heaven. And we do that looking outwards and say, everybody else, do the will of the Father. But before we do that, we need to do it looking inwards and say, let me do the will of the Father. Let me be one who, in all aspects, lives peaceably, but specifically for today in our work, let me be obedient to those who are in charge, to those who I am in submission to, with a peaceable spirit. For us to be able to do that, we're going to have to see that service to earthly masters is service to a heavenly master, is service to our God. And that will shape the way that we do it. That will shape the way that we think about it. I will say that there are those who have used this passage, however, and rightfully saw that he is calling us to be obedient to our earthly masters, and they will use that to say that there is a reason that I was not at the worship services. There's a reason that I forsook coming together. I know that I should have been gathered with my brethren. I know I'm called to praise my God and to partake of the Lord's Supper and to remember the death of his Son, but I was absent from worship because my boss has said, I want you to work this morning. I do want you to see something about this passage. Paul tells slaves, work for your master, unless they ask you not to come to worship, and then tell them go take a hike. He doesn't tell them that because they can't do that. They don't have the right to do that. They don't have the power to do that. You see, in fact, when you read through the book of Philemon, you see this relationship between a master and a slave with Philemon and Onesimus. And Paul doesn't just say, you know what, Onesimus, you're doing better work for the Lord. He says, I want you to go back to Philemon because that's what is right. And Philemon, I want you to offer forgiveness, and I want you to recognize the benefit that can serve me and that Onesimus has been in a servant to me. But he calls for them to act in the way that they're called to act. You're a master, obey the master. Or if you're a servant, obey the master. I bring that up to say this. We're not in that situation today. You're not a slave to a master. And we live, thank God, we live in a country that was founded on the concepts, however eroded and however misaligned those have maybe were then and have become today, that religious discrimination is something we don't want to see. And so we live in a time and in a place where we have the right to say, I'm going to go to church on Sunday. And that does not mean that a company cannot fire you for that. It's not against the law and say, you know what, this puts us in a hardship. We're going to find somebody that'll work on Sunday. And you need to understand that. Jesus calls for us to understand that. There is a cost for being a disciple. And he says, count that cost. But we do have the right and we do have the power, we do have the privilege to say, this is coming first. I'm going to serve my God first. But Paul is telling us that behind him, those that are in charge, those that manage us in some way, are to be treated with utmost respect, are to be treated with kindness from a peaceable spirit, and we are to make ourselves obedient to them. It's one of the first things that he points out in these passages. The next thing that he points out for us is this: recognize what it is you're working for. Again, as we said before, slaves became slaves for very different reasons. Working off debts, providing for family. And likewise today, people work for very different reasons. Some people work because they recognize that my family needs a home, they need a place to shelter them, they need food, I have to care for my kids and their needs and maybe even their futures, and all of these things come into the reason why I work. And there are other people who don't do that. There are people who have maybe done that in the past. Today they work because they tried this retirement thing and got bored and said, I need something to do. And so they go back and they re-enter the job force. And then there's others that have never worked for those reasons. We had everything we need. I work to fulfill my career, to advance myself, to challenge myself and prove and produce something from my life in these ways. No matter the reason we're working, God says recognize where the reward truly comes from and what the reward truly is. Have you ever thought during your time in employment that your boss or the company that you work for is just simply taking advantage of you? Like, they're just using me. I've got a skill, they just use that skill and they just use it, and I'm pretty sure that whenever it's no use anymore, they're just going to kick me to the wayside. They're just taking advantage of me. I want you to imagine how a slave in Roman times, how a Roman slave must have felt in this same way. I am being taken advantage of, and I don't have a way out. And that's why we get the story of Philemon and Onesimus. And that's why we get the story of those who are trying to escape these situations. And as I said before, a study of that book reveals that while Paul sent Onesimus back to him, he said he did that so that something good could be accomplished. What was the good? I'd argue is this point that he's making right here. When you feel like you're being taken advantage of, how do you react? Do you start to try to take advantage back? You know what? They don't seem to care about me. I'm not going to care about them. I'm going to start taking supplies from them. You ever been in an office situation and had the moral conundrum? I took this pen home with me from the office. Did I just steal from the company? Well, how about, maybe we have or haven't had those conversations in our brain, but how about the time that we knew our break was over, and yet, I'm going to take a few more minutes because, hey, I deserve it. They're a big company. It's not going to hurt them. This isn't going to hurt anybody. I'm going to take a sick day even though I know I'm not sick. I'll just call and make a little white lie and say, I want this day to myself. I think I deserve that. Paul calls for us to see that no matter what the company, no matter what the employer, no matter what the master, no matter what their characteristics are, you recognize who you're working for, you recognize that God is your true master, and you see that the reward is not the paycheck, is not the benefits, is not the retirement. It's God, it's heaven, it's a relationship with Him. When I left Lockheed Martin, I had to do an exit interview, which involved a lot more than it took to get into the company. One of the questions they had me fill out was, why are you leaving? What is your next position? What does your next company have to offer you that we don't have to offer? And so I just cheerfully wrote a better retirement package. I was leaving to become a preacher. I had to explain that to a recruiter who just completely was baffled how a church of 30 people could offer a better retirement package than billion-dollar Lockheed Martin. Well, I did that as a joke and just an opportunity to have a conversation. That's what Paul is calling us to see. No matter what this provides, paying off a debt, putting a roof over your family's house, setting aside for college, no matter what this job offers, it pales in comparison to the reward from your true master. You are workers in His field. And I know we think about that in evangelistic terms, because he talks about that in evangelistic terms. Sowing the seed, preparing the field, watering it. But what he calls us to see here is in our jobs, we are working for the master. Sometimes seeds are planted much deeper and into much more fertile soil through the examples that we show at times when people just seem to completely care less about us and mistreat us and focus on themselves more. And when we remember who it is we work for and we remember His reward, think of the impact that has on the world around us. Paul calls us to live and to work as if we recognize it is the Lord that is going to offer that reward. And he says it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter who you are either. You just got a job flipping burgers and salt and fries. You work for the Lord. Live as if you work for the Lord. Or maybe, you know what? No, I have got a self-made business that has grown and you know, we're doing pretty good for ourselves. It's great. You work for the Lord. Remember that you work for the Lord. Or I am the CEO of a multi-million-dollar company, and I make decisions every day that affect the livelihoods of hundreds, if not thousands of people. And if I make poor decisions, the stock market is affected. I mean, global change can happen if I don't do my job well. Paul would say, great for you, but you work for the Lord. Don't forget that you work for the Lord. He is the one that is going to give you your reward. Work for that reward. And the last thing I want to notice as we wrap all this up is where Paul ends it, speaking to the masters. In our context, speaking to those who are in charge, those who have been placed in a position of management over others. And he says, you need to know how to truly be in charge. Live up to your identity as a Christian in those moments. Those in charge, he says, you're to do exactly as those who have been placed in submission under you. The same things that I ordered them to do, you are to do as well. You must work with respect and kindness with all of your heart. You must use your authority as one who knows you work for the Lord. He is watching you, and I am serving for a reward from Him and nothing else. I'm serving God from the position that I manage. And that means that even though you have power in your position of authority, you're not to use that power in ungodly ways. He says here to give up threatening. We might talk about bullying or other ways in which we introduce violence and manipulation into the workforce. He said you cannot be living up to the brand of Christ if you are threatening servants to work. In the Roman days, he said, masters, you cannot live up to a Christ-like life if you're going to your servants saying, if you don't do what I say, I'm going to beat you to death. If you don't do what I say, I'm going to take all of the possessions that you have. I'm going to take even more than what you're indebted to. If you don't do what I say, I'm going to inflict carnage into your life. Were there consequences? Yes. Consequences that were put into effect, consequences that are even governed by the government. And are there consequences today? The end of Ephesians chapter 6, verse 9 is not Paul saying, managers, employers, masters, you can never bring forth the consequences of unsatisfactory work. Lay that out in front of a workforce. Say, listen, this is our starting time, this is our end time. If you can't respect that, we're going to have to find somebody that can. There are consequences. But those who are in charge of others are to remember that they have a master as well. And so they are to react and to act in certain ways. We're not going to be deceitful. We're not going to be bullying. We're not going to be manipulative and trying to force people to do the things that we have desire for them to do. Instead, he calls for them to work in a manner that recognizes the glory of God. He is your master. He is their master. He shows no partiality. Work in a manner fit to this. Another great example of that, John chapter 13. You go back there again, and you know what Jesus says? He says, the love that I have just shown you, this is the love I want you to show to the world. New commandment I have given you. What is he really saying? As rabbi, we already looked at him, thought of him as the humble servant that lowers himself even though he never deserved that. But now as rabbi, as teacher, as the Son of God, as the boss, what is he really saying? Here's the word. Let me show you by example what I want from you. It doesn't say if you all don't love one another, I'm gonna come down here and start smiting people. I'm gonna send lightning bolts into your life of calamity. He just says, look at me and look at what I'm doing. I'm gonna set the example. Follow me. Another thing this draws us to realize is this: just because we have authority over someone else, in the end, we all end up as equals. Because every one of us is at the foot of Jesus, and he is stooped over, and he is washing us. Master, slave, employee, employer, CEO, fry flipper. And here's the example he has set us. Love one another as I have loved you. We as masters, you must remember your true master. As we end this section, something that stands out about this whole passage, Galatians chapter 5, 22 through Galatians chapter 6, verse 9, something that stands out is this. It doesn't really matter where you are. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter who you're with. It doesn't matter the crowd that you're in. God says your lives are markedly different. You've been rebranded. You've been transformed from what you once were. Live different lives. And if that sounds familiar, it's because it is. You go back to Leviticus. The book of Leviticus, what does God tell the Israelites? It's a very similar message. He says when you're in the sewing room, and you're making garments, you're changed people. and you'll live changed lives. Don't mix the cotton and the polyester together. And when you're in the kitchen and you're preparing meals, you're a different people. And so you live different lives. So there are certain foods that you're going to cook and certain foods that we're going to stay away from. And when you're out in the field and you're sowing the rows, you're a changed people and you're going to live changed lives. So we're not going to mix the vegetables. And God gave them these seemingly arbitrary, and why does it matter? Aren't these insignificant things? Kind of like wives submitting to husbands and husbands sacrificing for wives and children obeying parents and fathers not provoking children to wrath and slaves being obedient with respect to masters and masters doing the same things to slaves, knowing that you have a master yourself. Isn't that insignificant? In the eyes of the world, they say yes. It doesn't really matter. But all of these things had great significance. God wasn't worried about fashion. He wasn't worried about hygiene. In fact, the book of Leviticus reveals again and again he was worried about holiness. You have been changed, or another word we might say is you have been sanctified. You have been set apart for the purposes of God. God who is set apart from all creation by indistinguishable degrees of holiness. He says, because I have set you apart to be holy, live holy lives. Peter is going to take what Paul is saying here and what Leviticus is saying. He's going to take those very same concepts and he's going to merge that all together, saying, in 1 Peter 2, you're a changed people, royal priesthood, holy nation. In chapter 1, he says, our God is holy. You too live holy lives. Today, friends, you are called to that holiness in all of our behavior and in our marriages and in our families and our dealings with those who have charge over us and those that we have charge over them. Be holy because your God is holy and he has called you through the gospel of his Son, through his death on the cross, into a life of holiness. And it's that we want to help you with this morning. Whether it be that you have answered that call, you've answered that call and you have come into this life of holiness through the blood of Jesus Christ that cleanses us, that washes our sins, that justifies our lives, but you have failed to continue to walk in that path. You've been changed. But instead of striving to live a life worthy of the change that has been produced in you, you've went back to your old life. You've grasped on to your dead body. You've readopted the way that you lived as an orphan away from God. You become divided and focus on self and care less for others. Today we would call you to remember the God of holiness that has called you into his family, that has changed you, that challenges you to live up to the brand that he has put upon your life, the seal of the Holy Spirit, the image of Christ in you. If you have never once began this walk, to have Christ modeled in you, to see the love of Christ embodied through you by your submission to him, as we kneel before him and he cleanses us, he washes us the same way as he did for those who followed him in John 13. As we fall before his cross and we are buried with him in the waters of baptism. If we have never started this walk, our desire this morning is to help you to see the love that God has for you as he offers the brand. He offers the image. He offers the change in your life. If we can assist you in seeing that, if we can assist you in coming to that, would you please come forward and we'll talk about that together right now as we stand and as we